Draw the curtains and expand your mind. It's time to get textual as we traverse the illicit pages of Wrongthink in the Forbidden Book Club.
Yes, it's the Forbidden Book Club. My favourite part of the program. I know some other people say it's their favourite part of the program as well, where we dive into an interesting, marginalised, forgotten or forbidden book. And today we've got, in my estimation, something really quite special for you. This book is, in my view, an incredible book, and it's an incredible piece of history, artifact of history, and it is this book, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbour, written by Rear Admiral Robert A. Theobald. Now, you will be forgiven for never having heard of this book. It's not a well-known book. It's a kind of disappeared, vanished, marginalized book. It's The Final Secret of Pearl Harbour, written by Robert A. Theobald. It was published in 1954 by a US publishing house, and obviously it deals with events. I'm assuming most of you will know, at least have a broad outline of the events that it's discussing. It's discussing the Japanese military, naval and military attack on Pearl Harbour in December 7th, 1941. It is the event that brought the USA into the Second World War. Before December 7th, 1941, the US was not directly a declared participant in the Second World War. December the 7th, 1941 is a keystone moment, I believe, in at least 20th century history. I actually think that the events of that time reverberate very strongly even to today. But it's acknowledged as one of the key dates of the 20th century when the Japanese Air Force and Navy attacked Pearl Harbour. Pearl Harbour is a sort of deep sea port in the Hawaiian Islands in the Pacific. It is a territory, a state of the USA. That date, December the 7th, 1941, has been transmitted through our culture, through popular culture, through history, through the media, as a day of infamy. That is actually a quote from the speech that US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt made the day after that attack. He declared it to be a day of infamy, where the Japanese launched a surprise attack, attack on the US, caught the US, as some commentators said at the time, with their pants down, and inflicted major destruction and major casualties on the US fleet. That was the bulk of which was then moored in Pearl Harbour, and launched the Pacific phase of the Second World War. And this book, look, in my view, this book, I would describe this book as a kind of historic hand grenade. This is no dusty, irrelevant tome. This is an explosive book. And once we've gone through some more details today, you'll be stunned that this book is not more well known, that this book is not taught in schools around the world. It has bombshell revelations, and I just want to point out that it's not hearsay from some geezer down the pub or whatever. It's written by Rear Admiral Robert A. Theobald. He was present in Pearl Harbour on the day. He was, in fact, on duty in Pearl Harbour that day as bombs were falling. It's also got, and I'm not sure if you can make it out on the video, but it's also got forwards. It's endorsed by Rear Admiral Kimmel, who was in charge of naval defences in Pearl Harbour that day, And it's also got an endorsement and a foreword by Fleet Admiral William Halsey. So we're talking about serious personages here. We're not talking about a bunch of geezers down the pub having a bit of a natter. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But we're talking about people who were present in military command capacities on the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked. These are people who were on the ground, and they are proposing a view of Pearl Harbor which is, interestingly, entirely contrary to the version of those key events that is still transmitted to us, that is still, if you open up a school textbook today, if you open up, and I don't recommend you do, unless you've got a strong stomach or you feel like a bit of a laugh, but if you were to go to Wikipedia or any of these mainstream sites, or the History Channel, or the whole transmitted narrative of these events at Pearl Harbor, what they're writing in this book, and they wrote it in 1954, so not that long after events, and they were all present at those events. What they're writing in this book is completely contradictory, and I would argue is basically a hand grenade that blows the accepted mainstream narrative of Pearl Harbor to pieces. Okay, now I just wanted to put a little bookend on that, so to speak. And Ed, if you could bring up those quotes. This is one of my favorite quotes, actually. And there are different translations of this quote because obviously it comes from French. But my favorite version of the quote is, "All history is but a lie agreed upon." It's otherwise translated sometimes as "history is a set of lies agreed upon." There also, obviously, it's translated out of the French. It comes from Napoleon Bonaparte, the famous general, commander-in-chief, and eventually French emperor. Not a insignificant historical personage. I would argue that being a key historical figure, Napoleon would have had some knowledge of how and understood how history was recorded and passed down. And even Napoleon said, "All history is but a lie agreed upon." You can equate that in some ways with the other famous quote, "History is written by the victors." We're going to see that today. We're going to see some serious distortions of history here. So Ed, let's get into that attack. I'm assuming most people know something about Pearl Harbor. Maybe some of you don't. We're going to run through, the basics of that attack. As I said, December the 7th, 1941, a day that, according to Roosevelt, went down in infamy. The US, apparently, unsuspectingly, with no provocation whatsoever, supposedly was attacked by the Japanese armed forces. The attack was honestly horrific. About half of the US fleet. You've got to keep in mind that the US was, even by that stage, was a major world power and was on its course to become the world's superpower. Half the US fleet was anchored in Pearl Harbor in the Pacific for defense and operations in the Pacific and in Far East Asia. The Japanese launched a supposedly sneak attack at about 7:30 in the morning. The Americans supposedly had no warning of this attack whatsoever, and they had no time to mobilize. They were decimated in this attack. There were 8 destroyers in the harbor at Pearl Harbor at the time. Most of them, a couple of them were sunk, and all of them were damaged. Almost all the US Air Force presence at Pearl Harbor, you saw those planes on the runways there, were destroyed on the ground. That's why people launch surprise attacks, because they want to catch forces unprepared and on the ground. And in that regard, the Japanese were extremely successful. This was a huge blow to American morale. And there were, here you can see, look, that might be the USS Arizona, or one of their large destroyers exploding. I mean, that looks like the ammunition hold or something or other like that, receiving a direct hit from a Japanese bomb or something and exploding. Some of these boats, and they had, hundreds, sometimes thousands of sailors and soldiers aboard. That one, for example, obviously in that photograph, exploded. There were mass casualties. I've read actually conflicting numbers. I've read anywhere between 3,000 and 4,000 US servicemen lost their lives on that day. That is not something that I think is to be forgotten. That is a horrific loss of life. As I said, it was a huge blow and a shock to the American public, and that's going to be important. Keep that in your mind as we proceed. It was a huge shock to the American psyche on that day in 1941. Ed, let's have a look at the US president at the time. This was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the US president. He is an iconic figure in US history and politics. He's famous for launching the New Deal, which was an attempt to drag the US out of the Great Depression. And he, as all are most political figures, he was a divisive figure. He was popular with some, but unpopular with others. Straight after the US was attacked, the US was very importantly, the US was at the time very largely what is now called an isolationist nation. After the experiences of the First World War from 1914 to 1918, and the US became involved later in the First World War, and that was with a lot of Americans, that was an unpopular move. The US being involved in what was described by some as foreign entanglements. A lot of US people, a lot of US citizens did not want to become involved in wars in Europe. They felt that that was none of the America's business. And in fact, there was a very large, what's now called an isolationist movement in the US. Polls just before the attack of Pearl Harbour, and obviously take polls with a grain of salt at all times, but even polls in the mainstream press in the US did say that 88% of Americans, 88% of Americans, that's a large percentage, were very strongly determined that the US should not get involved in any foreign wars whatsoever. They did not want to get involved in the European War, which was underway at that time, and they didn't want to get involved in any foreign entanglements. And there were large movements in the US. One of them was called America First, but there were large movements, lots of people involved. I think, from memory, I think America First had almost 900,000 members just of that movement, and there were other movements that were strongly what's now called isolationist. They didn't want the US involved in foreign wars. Ed, let's move on. There's FDR charming the press. He was very popular with a certain contingent in the press. Ed, let's move on to Japan. This is Admiral Yamamoto. He led the attack on Pearl Harbor. He's also an iconic figure. As I said, the attack was meant and designed as a surprise attack. Japan had a history of, if Japan went to war, of launching surprise attacks. They would often launch surprise attacks on the weekend, a Saturday or a Sunday, when people least expected it and there were less people at their posts, and so forth and so on. Japan had launched a famous naval attack against Russia in about 1904 or 1905. They had launched that on a Sunday. There's Admiral Nagano, one of the leaders of the attack on Pearl Harbor. We also have images, Ed, of the Japanese attacking planes, etc. There's probably a Zero or something taking off from a Japanese carrier, aircraft carrier. Aircraft carriers are very, very large ships, boats that you can launch planes from. Interestingly, just as a side note, and they're became key weapons of war in the Pacific War in particular. Interestingly, as a side note, the three very large US aircraft carriers, none of them were at harbour in Pearl Harbour that day. They were, I think one was on its way to Iceland, one was on the west coast of the US, and I think the other one was in dry dock. Very interestingly, none of the US's prime weapons were at harbour in Pearl Harbour that day. That's interesting. In light of what we'll get to soon, I think you'll find that very interesting. Now, right from the beginning, people had questions about Pearl Harbour. Americans had questions about Pearl Harbour. There was a journalist, a well-known journalist at the time, called John T. Flynn. He began as a supporter of President Roosevelt, but he turned against him. He was unimpressed by the New Deal. He thought that it was bringing socialism or even communism to the US, which he probably was in the beginning, very strong supporter of Roosevelt. He went against him. And in 1944, this pamphlet called The Truth About Pearl Harbour, which indicts basically Roosevelt, says that the attack on Pearl Harbour was Roosevelt's fault. He had goaded Japan into striking the first blow, but Roosevelt had secretly, even though publicly he often announced that he was opposed to getting involved in what's now known to us as the Second World War, but at the time was known as the European War. He was opposed to getting involved in that. Behind the scenes, John T. Flynn argued it was obvious that Roosevelt was doing everything he could to goad Japan into striking the first blow because he, for various reasons, wanted in on that European war. So John T. Flynn wrote that pamphlet, which was reasonably well known in 1944. There's just a little quote there from it, which I thought was interesting, just in a historical perspective, apart from anything else. And it talks about the day of the attack, December 7th. And I won't go into all the details right now, but Roosevelt, let's read it. This is from John T. Flynn. It is difficult to believe now that the President, his Secretaries of War and Navy could believe that they were adequately prepared for war in the Pacific. They clearly did. The President himself was so well pleased with the situation that after giving an ultimatum, because they had delivered an ultimatum to the Japanese, the US had placed an economic embargo along with Great Britain and the Netherlands on Japan and were, as you will see coming up, slowly strangling Japan as far as resources and oil and petroleum goes. And the US had delivered an ultimatum about that, and we'll read more about that later on. Roosevelt could go off on a vacation to Warm Springs, and when the blow seemed imminent, could isolate himself in his study with his telephone cut off while he fiddled around with his stamp collection. So isn't that interesting? At this moment of crisis, and even the mainstream press at the time was declaring that war might break out at any moment, and the US was secretly receiving all sorts of intelligence that was declaring exactly the same thing, the president decides it's a great time to take the phone off the hook. He actually put a do not disturb sign on his door and thought he would go through his stamp collection while the world was on the brink of war. Putting that in a historical context, it does remind me of events around, and we'll touch upon this again later on, but it does remind me of events around 9/11, the attacks on the US on the September 11th, 2001, where erstwhile US President George W. Bush, after being notified of those attacks, continued to read a book to the second grade class where he was in Florida. The book was called The Pet Goat, and he continued to leave 20 minutes or even half an hour reading the Pet Goat and being completely unavailable, interestingly enough, to respond in any sense to those attacks. It's an interesting historical parallel, I think. Anyway, Ed, just a brief mention of Admiral Kimmel. Admiral Kimmel was on the ground in Pearl Harbor that day. He did write a foreword to this book, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor. He had recently been promoted to Admiral, Ed, we've got the photo of him being promoted. It notes that they were happier times. As you will see as we go through this, Admiral Kimmel and General Short, who was the head of the army in Pearl Harbor, were thrown under the bus. They were made scapegoats. They were threatened with court-martial, and there was a campaign waged in the press, and you'll see more of this as we go on, to demonize those two commanders, and they were put in the very difficult situation of being threatened with court-martial, but also having their secrecy obligations, so they couldn't speak publicly to defend themselves because they were part of the military structure. So they could not speak publicly to defend themselves, but at the same time, they were being vilified in the press the whole time from leaks from the government, saying that they were responsible for the calamity in Pearl Harbor, etc., etc. I also wanted to introduce another character called Captain McCullum. This guy here, Captain Arthur McCullum, he was very close to Franklin Roosevelt. He was his routing officer, and that's someone who steers, is in charge of all the intelligence from the military that the president gets. He is a key figure. He wrote, in 1940, he wrote an extremely interesting memo, which was circulated through to the Defense Department and apparently made its way to Roosevelt. He outlined, in October of 1940, he wrote a memorandum advocating 8 actions that he predicted. This is October 1940, a year and a bit before the attack at Pearl Harbor. He wrote this memorandum advocating 8 actions that he predicted would lead to a Japanese attack on the US. They were trying to goad Japan. They were trying to force Japan into attacking the US. A. Make an arrangement with Britain for the use of British bases in the Pacific, particularly Singapore. B. Make an arrangement with Holland for the use of their base facilities and acquisitions of their supplies in the Dutch East Indies, which we now know as Indonesia. C. Give all possible aid to the Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek. Japan and China were at war at that stage, and so they were suggesting aiding Japan's enemy in China at that time. D. Send a division of long-range heavy cruisers to the Orient, Philippines, or Singapore. And then we've got the next 4 bullet points. Ed, yes, thank you. E. Keep 2 divisions of submarines in the Orient. F. Keep the main strength of the US fleet now in the Pacific in the vicinity of the Hawaiians. G. Insist that the Dutch grant Japanese demands for undue economic concessions, particularly oil. That is basically place an embargo on Japan. So because Japan, particularly as an island nation, does not have access to many resources, doesn't have access oil, and it's very short of resources on foreign external suppliers for the bulk of its resources. So the US, McCullum here, Captain McCullum, was advocating a strategy of can-off. And so they did advocate this economic embargo. There you say, not long after Captain McCullum's memorandum, grassroots organizations spring up out of nowhere, as does tend to happen sometimes, and there are patriotic San Franciscans heartily endorsing Roosevelt's embargo, called for in McCullum's memorandum, of any exports whatsoever. So they're placing an economic embargo on Japan, and that's a demonstration. As I said, these grassroots organizations just happen to pop up out of nowhere, and you get demonstrations in favor of placing an economic embargo on Japan. Ed, if we move forward, I'm just trying to give you as much background here as possible so that you understand the context that which the attack on Pearl Harbor happened. Also, very importantly, now the Japanese military, the Navy and the Army, they communicated, certainly all of their important military communications were sent in code. They were sent via one of these machines, which the US dubbed a purple machine, these machines encrypted the communications so that without the cipher, you couldn't, in theory, break those communications, and the ciphers would be changed every 24 hours. So as far as the Japanese knew, as far as the Japanese were concerned, they had a very secure system for military communications, strategic communications, and obviously those sort of communications can be incredibly important at a time of war or at a time of heightened conflict. So that's a machine that, actually, if we can stay on that machine there for a moment, Ed, that machine was the US, a machine cracked the Japanese code. They were successful. There was actually a number of Japanese codes. There were 29 Japanese naval codes, for example, and there was a diplomatic code. A diplomatic code is how embassies and ambassadors communicate with each other and communicate back with Tokyo to receive instructions and orders and so forth. The US, by October 1941, the US had cracked almost all of these Japanese codes. They'd certainly cracked the most important ones of them. As I said, there was 29 Japanese naval codes and also some diplomatic codes. The US had cracked almost all of them. Interestingly, if you go to Wikipedia or any of your mainstream historical sources today, and obviously if you're going to go to Wikipedia, you're going to need a strong stomach, they dispute this. They say that that is a far-right conspiracy theory and that the US had not cracked all these Japanese codes. I'm going to present to you today documentary evidence, a lot of it, almost all of it, out of this incredible book, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor. I'm going to present to you documentary evidence that, surprise, surprise, Wikipedia is being economical with the truth. Yes, surprise, surprise, they're lying. And I'll show you the documentary evidence straight out of this book that proves that they're lying. These codes, however, the US invested a huge effort into cracking these codes. This woman here, Agnes Driscoll, is credited with being the head of the code cracking division, the cryptologists, and having cracked the Japanese codes. So Admiral Theobald makes it plain in the book that by October of 1941, 2 months before the attack at Pearl Harbor, the US had cracked essentially all Japanese codes and had access to all Japanese military and diplomatic messages of any importance. Ed, if we move ahead, here we have what the US dubbed the splendid arrangement, and that is where they had listening posts, if you have a look closely there, you'll see these towers that are dotted around the Pacific. There are some obviously in East Asia there to the south of Japan, and there are some along the west coast of the US, and there are some in the middle of the Pacific, some in Hawaii even. That all of these listening posts were listening to these Japanese secret communications. They all had WINS machines, they were called, that could crack these Japanese codes, and the US Navy and the US Army were both responsible. They both had cryptology departments that were busy, very busy, cracking these Japanese codes, and then they had an entire secret delivery system for delivering these intercepted secret Japanese messages throughout their command structure. The president got to see them, Secretary of the Navy got to see them, Secretary of War got to see them. There was a whole distribution network so that every day, generally, the people in positions of power in the US were reading these secret, supposedly secret, Japanese communications. Ed, if we keep going, the sorts of communications that Wikipedia will tell you don't exist and weren't cracked by the US are available in this book and other places. And that's a sketch that a Japanese spy, because the Japanese had spies, obviously, and that they had a number of spies on the ground at Pearl Harbor, keeping a very close eye on the US fleet moored there. That's a sketch from one of their spies that they transmitted of all the boats that were in Pearl Harbor. From about October 1941 onwards, the Tokyo was sending out messages. You'll note here it's denoted as strictly secret, but Tokyo is sending out messages, and that's a message to some of its spies in Honolulu, in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, and the message is strictly secret. Henceforth, we would like to have you make reports concerning vessels along the following lines insofar as possible. They wanted, number one, the waters of Pearl Harbor are to be divided roughly into 5 sub-areas. We have no objections to you abbreviating as much as you like. And they wanted a detailed description of what boats are in Pearl Harbor, descriptions of the boats, descriptions of the manpower. They wanted every piece of information they could possibly have about what was going on in Pearl Harbor. I can't imagine why they might want that information. Seems fairly obvious, doesn't it? So this is in September 1941. That secret message is cracked and is distributed through this chain all the way up to President Roosevelt. US military figures have access to this Japanese information, have access to the information that the Japanese are paying particular military and surveillance and spy attention to what's going on in Pearl Harbor. And here's just another cracked message, which is yet again asking for more information about what's going on in Pearl Harbor. This has been going on for months. This message is actually from January of 1941. For almost a year, Japanese had secretly, they thought, been paying very close surveillance attention to Pearl Harbor. Okay, the Japanese obviously they said this quite plainly, they felt that they were being secretly crushed economically and diplomatically by the US, and they wanted to break that stranglehold, and they felt that attacking the US fleet in Pearl Harbor was probably their best way of disabling the US fleet so that they could get access essentially to oil from Indonesia, which they were currently not able to do. And they felt that attacking Pearl Harbor was their best option in that regard. Now we're going to dive into reading excerpts from this book now, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor. We'll read quite a few excerpts from the book because they're very, very interesting. These excerpts will blow to pieces. Recall I said this book is basically like a historic hand grenade. Those excerpts will blow to pieces the accepted mainstream narrative of events around Pearl Harbor, of this sneak surprise attack, this treacherous knife in the back that the US received. These excerpts will essentially blow that into 1,000 pieces. I can't read you the whole book, obviously. I'd kind of like to. That's the sort of guy I am. But the book is over 200 pages long, and, sitting here reading this to you for the bulk of a day is probably not the most practical thing for either of us. So I'm going to read you excerpts, but I will read you extended excerpts from the book. Ed, let's dive in. Okay, now, interestingly, this is also very interesting. As I said, and as you can probably assume, this is a hard book to find, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor. It's not an easy book to find. I've only ever seen one copy in the wild, and this is it. It's not an easy book to find, and I couldn't find any PDFs or anything like that of it on the internet. The only thing that I could find, courtesy of the CIA's website, is, and this is interesting, is a declassified version of the US World News Report, which was a popular magazine of the time. They serialized this book. That means they printed sort of an advance copy of the book to whet people's interest in the books. They serialized the book in early April 1954, a couple of weeks before the book was due to be published. That, as you can see by looking at the top there, that magazine was classified by the CIA. I've taken this directly from the CIA's website. It was, as you can read for yourself up the top there, declassified in 2005. I do not know the circumstances behind this classification. I have no other information except that this is available on the CIA's website, and you can read for yourself, as I did, that it was declassified in 2005. That obviously means that it was classified at some point. At what point it was classified, I do not know. Does that mean that the book was classified also at some point? It's possible. I don't know. The book is certainly hard to find, and it's rarely, if ever, mentioned. There's basically a blackout on this book. You never hear about it, even though it's written by, well, it has the involvement of 3 US naval admirals in this book. You never, ever hear it mentioned, ever, anywhere, as far as histories go. But it was serialized in the US News and World Report in 1954. And I'm going to read, and it's identical to the transcript of the book itself. So I'm going to read to you from that magazine. And it starts off with an introduction. And the introduction is useful because it summarizes quite neatly the main points of the book and what we're going to talk about today. And it starts off, what is the truth about Pearl Harbor? This question is still being asked 12 years after the attack and notwithstanding 8 official investigations. So obviously Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, and this is now in 1954. These investigations, in the minds of many people, left disturbing questions still unanswered, curious actions unexplained. Who was really to blame for this worst of all US military disasters? Because despite this blanket coverage in the media, there were many people who still had questions about Pearl Harbor, the events at Pearl Harbor, and how they could have possibly happened the way that they had been explained by politicians and by the media. It didn't really add up, and a lot of people noticed, but they had little voice publicly. Now comes a new explanation. It's in a book called The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, written by Robert A. Theobald, a Rear Admiral in the US Navy, now retired, who was in command of destroyers at Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack. Admiral Theobald puts the responsibility for Pearl Harbor on one man, President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The president, he says, deliberately invited the Japanese attack, knew it was coming, and deliberately withheld this knowledge from US commanders in Hawaii. What we're talking about here, I would suggest, is treasonous, traitorous behavior. Anyway, this, the author says, is why Pearl Harbor was caught by surprise on December 7th, 1941, why 4,575 Americans were killed or wounded. 18 ships sunk or damaged, 177 airplanes lost. President Roosevelt's purpose? To bring the US into war against Nazi Germany, according to Admiral Theobald. He says that Mr. Roosevelt was convinced that a Japanese attack was the only way to win solid public support for the war that he believed the US should fight. Remember that polls just before Pearl Harbor had said that 88% of Americans, that's a huge percentage, were absolutely against US involvement in any of these foreign wars. If the administration, if figures in power wanted to drag the US into war, they had to do something to change the minds of 88% of the population. Otherwise, they had a big problem on their hands. To support his claim, Admiral Theobald bears official records. He prints the secret Japanese messages decoded and delivered to the White House, that Wikipedia says don't exist, that revealed the Japanese plot in advance of the attack. He tells what went on behind the scenes in Washington. In the 8 official investigations conducted under Democratic administrations, most of the blame for Pearl Harbor was put on 2 men, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter C. Short, then top US commanders in Hawaii. Admiral Theobald calls this an injustice, says the full story was kept in a political secret. Corroborative forwards were written by Admiral Kimmel and Fleet Admiral William Halsey. In his forward, Admiral Halsey says that Admiral Kimmel and General Short were military martyrs. And there it is. I've just grabbed that in case you couldn't see it earlier on. I've just grabbed a close-up of that CIA classification and declassification notice that is on that newspaper magazine article. As I said, I don't know if that also applied to the book. It's possible that it did. The book is certainly hard to find and certainly very rarely, almost never mentioned. Now, we're going to go to Admiral Kimmel's foreword. He wrote a foreword to the book, and we're going to read it in full because it gives us a nice overview. Instead of reading the 203 pages of the book, we'll just give highlights of the information. Rear Admiral Theobald's studies have caused him to conclude that we were unready at Pearl Harbor because President Roosevelt's plans required that no word be sent to alert the fleet in Hawaii. He has produced a readable, concise, and convincing presentation of the evidence which supports his deductions regarding the President's plan and the details of its execution. In my philosophy, I can find no reasons which justify the formulation and execution of such a plan. So Kimmel is saying he cannot understand why Roosevelt, if that is true, drags the US into this war. He cannot see it as justified. The individuals in high positions in Washington who willfully refrained from alerting our forces at Pearl Harbor should never be excused. Kimmel's angry. He's angry about this. The commanders at Pearl Harbor, he speaks, and this book is written in a very concise and sober and sort of stern. It's not a colorful book. It's not full of tabloid descriptions or attempts to pull on people's heartstrings. It's a book written by military men, for military men. I still recommend it. It's an excellent, excellent book. But it's not written in emotive language. It's written in very concise, sober language. And I'll go on. The commanders at Pearl Harbor were never informed of the text, nor even given a summary of the American note delivered to the Japanese ambassadors on November 26, 1941, which effectively ended the possibility of further negotiation and thus made the Pacific War inevitable. They were never informed that the United States had assured the British of armed support if the Japanese attacked the British. The existence of this assurance was divulged during the congressional investigation in 1946. During some 3 months prior to the attack, several inconsequential Japanese intercepts were supplied to me, but a great number of vitally important messages were not disclosed. And these would have disclosed Japanese intentions were never supplied to the commanders at Pearl Harbor. Notably, the Tokyo-Honolulu dispatches regarding the exact location of ships berthed in Pearl Harbor. I showed some of those to you earlier on. There were many of them. The Tokyo-Washington messengers, that's messages from Tokyo to its Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C., which emphasized a deadline date by which the Washington Conference must reach a satisfactory agreement, or after that, things are automatically going to happen. So these are all sorts of signs of war, very obvious signs of war that the Japanese were transmitting in what they thought were secret messages, but the US had access to all of them. The lack of vital intercepts received, decoded, and delivered to responsible officials in Washington on December 6 and December 7, 1941, was sent to the Navy and Army commanders in the Hawaii area. Kimmel is saying that he was denied access, and we'll cover this in more detail later on. He was denied access to all of these secret communications. He was in charge of the defenses of Pearl Harbor, and he was completely denied access to this information. Admiral Theobald was serving as Commander Destroyer's Battle Force and was actually in the port of Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked. He assisted me and was present when I gave my testimony before the Roberts Commission. He writes about with the authority of personal knowledge concerning the proceedings of that commission, as well as the events that preceded the attack on the fleet. So that's Admiral Kimmel's introduction. I'll also read a few excerpts from Admiral Halsey's foreword. Admiral Halsey was not a nobody. In fact, he's a very famous name in history. There's even a Beach Boys song that name checks him. So he's not a nobody. He's a notable historic figure. He also wrote a foreword to the book endorsing its premise. Admiral Theobald's book digests and correlates the results of his painstaking research into the mass of documentary evidence. Whether or not you agree with any or all of his conclusions, his book is a must for every American who believes in fair play. Read it with an open mind and arrive at your own conclusions. I find in it an approach different from any I have previously seen to the disaster at Pearl Harbour on December the 7th, 1941. At that time, I was one of the 3 senior commanders of the Pacific Fleet, serving under Admiral Kimmel. I am sure he kept me informed of all the intelligence he possessed. Certainly, I did not know then of any of the pertinent magic messages. The Japanese intercepts were codenamed Magic because they thought the technology was so incredible that they could have these transcripts so quickly and so reliably. They called them the magic messages. All our intelligence pointed to an attack by Japan against the Philippines. So all the information that they were being given in the Navy was leading them to think that the Japanese might well attack in the Philippines. They were being denied the direct intelligence that pointed very, very, very strongly to an attack at Pearl Harbor. All their intelligence pointed to an attack by Japan against the Philippines or the southern areas of Malaysia or the Dutch East Indies, which is we now know as Indonesia. While Pearl Harbor was considered and not ruled out, the mass of the evidence made it available to us pointed in another direction. Had we known of Japan's minute and continued interest in the exact location of movement of our ships in Pearl Harbor as indicated in the magic messages, it is only logical that we would have concentrated our thought on meeting the practical certainty of an attack on Pearl Harbor. I am sure I would have protested the movement of my task force out of Pearl Harbor. As I said, the aircraft carriers, the strongest weapons in the Navy, were moved out fortuitously with great prescience not long before the Japanese attacked. Let's move on, Ed. I then had my flag on the Enterprise, one of those carriers, one of the 2 carriers which we had operating in the Pacific. The second was the Lexington, part of a force under Rear Admiral Newton's command. The Saratoga, the 3rd and only other carrier assigned to the Pacific Fleet, was on the west coast of the United States, completing periodic overhaul and repair. As I said, all of their strongest naval weapons, the aircraft carriers that, can launch hundreds of fighters and bombers, were elsewhere. Nevertheless, had the magic messages been known to us, there can be no doubt that a 360-degree search would have been ordered. That is, they would have fanned out from Pearl Harbor, searching in all directions for the Japanese fleet, and maintained to the breaking point of material and personnel. What he's saying is they would have done everything they could. If they had those messages, they would have instituted as much surveillance around Pearl Harbor as they possibly could. I have always considered Admiral Kimmel and General Short to be splendid officers who were thrown to the wolves as scapegoats for something over which they had no control. They had to work with what they were given, both in equipment and information. They are our outstanding military martyrs. So this is the Admiral of the US fleet declaring them to be military martyrs. And he's writing that in September of 1953, just prior to the publication of this book. It's really quite astounding, actually. Ed, let's keep rolling. Now, we'll go to some excerpts from the author's introduction as well. I'll read to you some of those. It is firmly believed that those in Washington who knew the facts decided from the first that considerations of patriotism and loyalty to the wartime commander-in-chief, that's the president, required that a veil of secrecy should be drawn about the president's handling of the situation which culminated in the Pearl Harbor attack. While there was great justification for this secret during the continuance of the war, the reasons for it no longer exist. He's writing in 1954, remember. The war is finished. President Roosevelt and his administration are now history. Dictates of patriotism requiring secrecy regarding a line of national conduct in order to preserve it for possible future repetition do not apply in this case, because in the atomic age, facilitating an enemy surprise attack as a method of initiating a war is unthinkable. So what Theobald is saying is that he understands that for reasons of waging war and reasons of patriotism, much of this information had to be kept secret during the war itself, because obviously you're in the military and you want your country to win the war. He understands that, but he's saying now, in 1954, 13 or so years after those events, it's now time to make all this available to the public, available to history. People should have this information. Also, no doubt, he also believes that people who were scapegoated for the disaster of these attacks should now have their names cleared. Pearl Harbour losses would preclude that course of action in the future without consideration of the increased destructiveness of present and future weapons. So he's also saying that this is the strategy that is outlined in this book of Roosevelt luring Japan into attacking Pearl Harbour is no longer valid in the age of nuclear weapons. He's suggesting that kind of strategy simply does not apply anymore. Finally, loyalty to their late president in the matter of Pearl Harbour would be better served today if his friends would discard their policy of secrecy in favour of full publicity. So Theobald is saying that, the reasons for the secrecy simply no longer apply. President Roosevelt circumvents American pacifism. Pacifism is the desire to have peace. And it's being suggested that Roosevelt simply worked his way around that desire for peace. And we're going to chapter 1. Main deduction. President Roosevelt circumvents American pacifism. In the spring of 1940, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, and France were conquered by Germany. So we're talking here about the beginnings of the Second World War. And throughout the remainder of that year, Great Britain's situation was so desperate that many expected her collapse early in the ensuing year. Fortunately, however, the Axis powers turned east in 1941 to conquer Greece and to attack Russia. So he's talking about a pivotal moment in the Second World War, which is kind of written out of history now, certainly forgotten. For a while there, it really did look like Germany would win. Germany had impressive military victories, and there was a tension. I mean, I know this speaking to relatives and so forth. They thought that Great Britain was on the brink of collapse. The German Navy had encircled Great Britain, and supplies and resources could not get in or out, and Great Britain was slowly but surely starving. Continuing, there is reason to believe that when France was overcome, President Roosevelt became convinced the United States must fight beside Great Britain, while the latter was still an active belligerent, or later sustained the fight alone as the last democratic stronghold in a Nazi world. Never, however, had the country been less prepared for war, both psychologically and physically. Isolationism was a dominant philosophy throughout the land, and the armed forces were weak and consequently unready. So what Theobald is saying here, and this is very interesting, he has a different perspective to Kimmel. He understands, he agrees with the strategy of goading Japan into attacking the US so that the US could, the US government could overcome the reluctance of its domestic population they could overcome the reluctance of their domestic population and drag the US into war. Theobald says, very interestingly, that he actually agrees with that strategy. but he disagrees with now keeping it secret. The United States not only had to become an active participant in democracy's fight as quickly as possible, but a people completely united in support of the war effort had to be brought into the arena. But how could the country be made to fight? And this is important, only a cataclysmic happening could move Congress to enact a declaration of war, and that action would not guarantee that the nation's response would be completely united support which victory has always demanded. This was the president's problem, and his solution was based upon the simple fact that while it takes two to make a fight, either one may start it. As the people of this country were so strongly opposed to war, one of the Axis powers must be forced to involve the United States, and in such a way as to arouse the American people to wholehearted belief in the necessity of fighting. This would require drastic action, and the decision was unquestionably a difficult one for the president to make. In this connection, it should be remembered that Japan, Germany, and Italy signed the Tripartite Treaty on September 28, 1940, by which the three nations agreed to make common cause against any nation not then a participant in the European War or the Sino-Japanese conflict, that's the war between Japan and China, which attacked one of the signatories. Thereafter, the fact that war with Japan meant war with Germany and Italy played an important part in President Roosevelt's diplomatic strategy. Throughout the approach to war and during the fighting, the primary US objective was the defeat of Germany. To enable that, the president instituted a successful campaign to correct the nation's military unpreparedness. Second, often offered Germany repeated provocations by violations of neutrality and diplomatic usage. Number three, applied ever-increasing diplomatic and economic pressure upon Japan, which reached its sustained climax on July the 25th, 1941, when the United States, Great Britain, and the Netherlands stopped their trade with Japan and subjected her to almost complete economic encirclement. Number four, made mutual commitments with the British Prime Minister, that was Winston Churchill, at Newfoundland in August 1941, which promised mutual support in the event that the United States, Great Britain, and a third country, not then at war, were attacked by Japan in the Pacific. So secretly, Roosevelt had made a deal with Winston Churchill in August of 1941, this deal that would drag them into war. Number five, terminated the Washington Conference with a note of November 26, 1941. That was about the negotiations that were still going on between the US and Japan. Essentially, the US brought an end to those negotiations. The US delivered an ultimatum to Japan to either do exactly what the US wanted, which was basically give up, or essentially go to war. Number six, and this is important, retained a weak Pacific Fleet in Hawaiian waters, despite contrary naval advice, where it served only one diplomatic purpose, an invitation to a Japanese surprise attack. And that furthered that surprise by causing the Hawaiian commanders to be denied invaluable information from decoded Japanese dispatches concerning the rapid approach of the war and the strong probability that the attack would be directed at Pearl Harbour. So in a sense, he's saying that the weakened, minimized, halved fleet was housed at Pearl Harbour as a lure, as a bait, to lure the Japanese into seizing what they clearly would have thought as their best moment, their best chance to disable as much of US military power as possible by striking Pearl Harbour. The fleet was left there deliberately. He is saying, one of the US admirals is saying it was obviously deliberately left there as a lure to tempt Japan into attacking it, thus dragging Japan and Europe into this war with the US. This denial of information was a vital feature of enticing a Japanese surprise attack upon Pearl Harbor. If Admiral Kimmel and General Short had been given the knowledge possessed by the Washington authorities, the Hawaiian commands would have been alerted against an overseas attack. The Pacific Fleet would have been kept out of danger on those days of December 1941 until the issue of peace or war had been decided. With the highly effective Japanese espionage in Hawaii, they had good spies on the ground. This would have caused Tokyo to cancel the surprise attack. So he's saying that if they had moved what remained of the fleet out of Pearl Harbor, as they probably would have done if they had received those secret messages, Japan obviously would have called off the attack, and you wouldn't have the US and Japan at war in the Second World War. Diplomatically, President Roosevelt's strategy of forcing Japan to war by unremitting and ever-increasing diplomatic economic pressure and by simultaneously holding our fleet in Hawaii as an invitation to a surprise attack was a complete success. So Theobald, very interestingly, he's declaring this strategy of Roosevelt's to be a success. It achieved its desired result. It forced, by his words, Japan into attacking at Pearl Harbor, thus initiating the US into the Second World War. Theobald declares this militarily to be a successful strategy. Militarily, our ship and personnel losses mark December 7th, 1941, however, as the day of tragic defeat. Militarily, a success, but also massive losses. One is forced to conclude that the anxiety to have Japan, beyond all possible dispute, commit the first act of war caused the president and his civilian advisors to disregard the military advice, which would somewhat have cushioned the blow. The president, before the event, probably envisaged a Panay incident of somewhat lesser proportions. Despite the fact that the attack laid the foundation for eventual complete victory, a terrific price was paid, as the following account of the ship's plane and personnel losses discloses. We won't go into those losses in detail right now. We'll cover that later on. But obviously, Theobald is saying that we paid an enormous price for that military gambit, that lure that was offered to Japan. The US paid a huge military price. It paid a huge price in personnel and tragedy, and he acknowledges that. That's Admiral Kimmel, who you will see gets thrown to the wolves. I think we also have a photo of General Short. General Short was also threatened with court-martial and was silenced so that himself and Kimmel could not defend themselves. And they were the blame for the military disaster, and that military disaster was hidden from the US public for quite a while. It was not made plain to the public what a disaster Pearl Harbor had been. That was kept secret for quite a while, for obvious reasons of morale. But those two, commanders were thrown to the wolves. We'll go ahead now to chapter 3, which is entitled Magic, and it's about the cracking of the Japanese codes, which is fundamental to this story. The Japanese Purple Code. The Japanese high security communication systems were all encrypted codes. The Purple Code differed from the others in that it employed a machine to accomplish its encrypting and deciphering. Washington broke this Purple Code so completely that not only was the code recovered and the cipher recognized as machine controlled, as in the code was generated by machines, but the mechanics of the machine were also fully diagnosed. As a consequence, a number of purple cipher machines were fabricated for use by American and British decrypting units. And earlier on, we showed you a photo of those machines that were used to decode the Japanese codes. Now, there was as I said earlier, there was a distribution network for all the information that was secured out of these broken Japanese codes. And you can see there, the Navy Department's distribution, the War Department's distribution. I'll simply note that at the top of that list is President Roosevelt. And also on that Navy list is Captain and Commander McCullum, the guy who wrote, if you remember earlier on, those 8 suggestions for goading Japan into war with the US. McCullum is also receiving all of these secret communications. Notably, not on this list are the commanders in Pearl Harbor. They were on this list up until July of 1941. Then, just a few months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, they were surprisingly removed from the distribution list. Oh, I wonder why. Let's go on. The complete denial of magic to Hawaii after mid-August 1941. Exactly. Admiral Kimmel told the Joint Congressional Committee that during July 1941, he received the meanings of 7 decoded Japanese dispatches, but that after early August, the Navy Department sent him no word which adequately portrayed the growing tension between the United States and Japan, or suggested the possibility of Japanese action in the Hawaii area in event of war. The timing of this silence is most significant. The diplomatic economic encirclement of Japan had been in effect less than 3 weeks. Does anyone else smell some sort of subterfuge? President Roosevelt returned from his Newfoundland conferences with Mr. Churchill in the middle of August. So Roosevelt and Churchill had struck a deal in August, and then all of a sudden, communications to the commanders in Pearl Harbor go silent. Japan was soon to be forced by the United States to choose between war or surrender to the economic encirclement. And here we are. We have some of these decoded messages. Ed, let's just run through these. You know, these are more instructions from Japan to surveil. You can see it's from their capital in Tokyo to their embassy in Honolulu. And they're just saying that as relations between Japan and the United States are most critical, make up your surveillance of the ship in harbour report irregular, but at a rate of at least twice a week. Although you already are no doubt aware, please take extra care to maintain secrecy. So they're getting messages which the US is decoding to up your surveillance of the boats in Pearl Harbor because things have reached a critical, tense juncture. They go on. This is a further communication on November the 29th, 1941. We've been receiving reports from you on ship movements, but in the future, will you also report even when there are no movements? So they want reports of ship movements in Pearl Harbor, but they also want reports of nothing happening. They want as much information as they can possibly get. These are the messages that are in this book. They're literally in this book. This book right here, these messages are decoded and in this book, but they are denied by history, denied by the education system, denied by popular culture, but they're all in this book. The US had access to all of these messages, which frankly, if you are of above or average intelligence, would scream to you that war is inevitable and that the Japanese are considering, or in fact planning, to attack Pearl Harbor. Now, we'll get to chapter 13, the final summation. Obviously, I can't, unfortunately, read you the whole book, but I'm trying to give you the basic framework and the sort of highlights and the strongest, most obvious points of what's being said in the book. So let's read on in chapter 13. A few of the American moves which led to the Japanese attack. Our main deduction is that President Roosevelt forced Japan to war by unrelenting diplomatic economic pressure and enticed that country to initiate hostilities with a surprise attack by holding the Pacific Fleet in Hawaiian waters as an invitation to that attack. The evidence, which was presented in detail in chapter 2, shows how surely the president moved towards war after June 1940. his conversation with Admiral Richardson in October 1940, indicating his conviction that it would be impossible without a stunning incident to obtain a declaration of war from Congress. So you've seen some of the secret messages, but there are many more in the book that the US had access to. You've seen Captain McCullum's 8 points that he suggests are the way to drag Japan into war. You've seen Roosevelt say that the only way to awake the US populace in favor of war is some sort of stunning surprise attack, some sort of cataclysm, as he said. Despite the conditions of undeclared war which existed in the Atlantic during the latter half of 1941, it had long been clear that Germany did not intend to contribute to the creation of a state of formal war between her and the United States. That is, Germany had done, according to Admiral Theobald, Germany had done everything that it could to not provoke the US and to not enter into war with the US. The Tripartite Treaty of September 1940, however, supplied the president with the answer. Under that treaty, war with Japan meant war with Germany and Italy. President Roosevelt's strategy accomplishes its purpose. Thus, by holding a weak Pacific fleet in Hawaii as an invitation to a surprise attack, and by denying the commander of that fleet the information which might cause him to render that attack impossible, President Roosevelt brought war to the United States on December 7th, 1941. He took a fully aroused nation into the fight because none of its people suspected how the Japanese surprise attack fitted into their president's plans. Disastrous as it was from a naval standpoint, the Pearl Harbour attack proved to be the diplomatic prelude to the complete defeat of the Axis powers. As I said earlier, Theobald says this strategy ultimately was successful. As each reader will make up his own mind regarding the various questions raised by President Roosevelt's solution to his problem, nothing would be gained by an ethical analysis of that solution. I'm going to read that to you one more time. As each reader will make up his own mind regarding the various questions raised by President Roosevelt's solution to his problem, nothing would be gained by an ethical analysis of that situation. What Theobald is saying is that he's making a strategic analysis, but he's not making a moral or ethical analysis. He's going to leave that analysis to the reader of this book. That analysis of, was it worth for almost 5,000 US sailors dying in frankly horrible circumstances, dying trapped in bombed and destroyed boats, drowning to death. Some of them took hours to drown to death, apparently the most horrible deaths that you can possibly imagine. Theobald is saying, I will leave that to you to decide ethically and morally what you make of that. Now, we're going to go, this book obviously is from 1954. Since then, other people have raised this theory. Let's put it that, let's be so generous. According to Wikipedia, it's a far-right conspiracy theory, but other people have written on it. There's a great book called Day of Deceit. This book, I think it was from about 2000 and 2001. This is a much easier book to get hold of and I do highly recommend this book. It takes the arguments of Theobald's book, Final Secret of Pearl Harbour, and expands upon them with a great deal more evidence, a lot more secret communications are printed in here, and there's a pile more evidence. There's 400 or 500 pages of evidence here. It's very persuasive. But the argument, the basic structure, the outline of what is being said in here by Robert Stinnett is essentially the same. He's just marshaled, with more decades in the rearview mirror, he's marshaled even more evidence, and it's even more convincing, and it's even more irrefutable, I would argue. And this, as I said, this book is, it's not falling off the shelves, but it is available. So if you are interested, I would really recommend reading it. It's really persuasive. And I'm just going to read to you a tiny excerpt from this book, Day of Deceit. And again, it's chapter 13, coincidentally. The chapter is entitled A Pretty Cheap Price. And it's talking about events December 1st to December 6th, 1941. In his post-war testimony to Congress, Admiral Kimmel maintained that he would have been ready to defend Pearl Harbor, quoting, if I had anything which indicated to me the probability of an attack on Hawaii. The information that Kimmel needed was available, so available, in fact, that it often appears as though the Japanese had made few efforts to conceal it. As we now know, Lieutenant Commanders Joseph Rochefort and Edwin Layton could have provided that indication, but they did not do so. Their failure allowed Japan's first air fleet to make its surprise attack and then escape to Japan. In a post-war assessment of the attack, Rochefort said it was a pretty cheap price to pay for unifying the country. I'm just going to say that again. It was a pretty cheap price to pay for unifying the country. But others would angrily question that conclusion. 7 Japanese naval broadcasts intercepted between November 28th and December the 6th confirmed that Japan intended to start a war and that it would begin at Pearl Harbor. The evidence that poured into American intelligence stations is overpowering. All the broadcasts have one common denominator. None ever reached Admiral Kimmel. So by this stage, by the time that Stinnett has written Day of Deceit, he is declaring the evidence overpowering. This book is chock full of decoded Japanese messages which state plainly that they intend to attack Pearl Harbor and they intend to go to war with the US. In fact, there was a 14-point message that was sent through to the the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C. the day before the attack, December 6th, which was a message for the Japanese ambassador to declare war on the US at 1 p.m. on December the 7th. The US had complete access to that message by 9 p.m. of the day before Japan officially declared war on the US, synchronized essentially to the time of the attack in Pearl Harbor, which is 7:30 in the morning, was 1 p.m. Washington, D.C. time. The US and Roosevelt had access to that information, that message, the day before. And that message is printed in full. It's quite a long message, actually. The Japanese ambassador's declaration of war is quite long. It has 14 parts, which was transmitted separately for the Japanese thought for security reasons. They would send it in 14 different separate sections, but the US had access to the whole thing the day before. It's compelling evidence, you know. There are other books that touched on this because, interestingly, now even though this is written out of history now, you're a heretic, you're a far-right conspiracy theorist, as according to Wikipedia, if you question the consensus mainstream opinions about Pearl Harbor. But there are actually many other books that do the same. This book is interesting. It's written by an Australian military officer and someone else. This one also indicts Winston Churchill. The argument of this book is that Churchill was somewhat subtly manipulating Roosevelt into goading Japan into striking the first blow so that he could have use of Roosevelt's army and resources, basically. It doesn't completely put Roosevelt off the hook, but it argues that Churchill was a major player in this. There were many journalists at the time. As I said, there was a large force in US American society at the time that was pacifist, that didn't want to be involved in any more foreign entanglements, any more foreign wars. There were plenty of other voices who cast doubt upon what had happened at Pearl Harbor and the lead up to that. There was a very famous US historian, Harry Elmer Barnes, possibly the most, or definitely one of the most best known historians in the US up to that stage. He wrote this book. It's actually a collection of all sorts of different articles from that era, Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace. He was as I said, a very famous historian up until he came out against US involvement in the Second World War, and he maintained that opinion throughout the war, which is a difficult position to maintain. A lot of people didn't, but he maintained that throughout the war and after it, and he was essentially, in today's terminology, cancelled. He's basically unknown today, but he was very well known at the time. A book that we've touched on here before at All Out of Bubblegum, we've done an episode about this before, Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. The fellow who allegedly wrote this book, his uncle was at Pearl Harbor. He also wrote a newspaper that he privately printed in the early 1970s, declaring that he had seen secret cables because he worked there was actually a secret decoding station in Pearl Harbor that Admiral Kimmel did not have access to. He did not have security clearance to have access to that information. So Japanese secret communications were actually being decoded in a secret cryptography station in Pearl Harbor that Kimmel didn't have access to. And the uncle of the guy who allegedly wrote this worked there. He printed a private newspaper in the early 70s detailing his history of seeing all these secret communications and knowing that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor for weeks beforehand. That newspaper, it's around here somewhere. I'm not sure exactly where it is, but it's around here somewhere. Ed, let's keep moving. My point is that there were numerous voices who were calling this out at the time, but they have been basically written out of history. And this is one of the many memorials to as you saw earlier on, it's estimated 4,500 US soldiers and sailors who lost their lives on that attack on December 7th, 1941. This is a memorial to the sailors who were entombed in the Arizona that sunk in Pearl Harbor. A horrible loss of life. I think if that was your father or your brother or your son that was lost there, you would want answers. You would demand answers. And people did. Let's move on, Ed. As I said, people knew at the time this is a cartoon from 1945, from a US magazine in 1945 that's already blowing the whistle. It's if you zoom in and have a read of it, you'll notice that there's a man there who looks a bit Japanese. He's ringing a bell, out the front of Congress, saying, "We are going to attack early in December. Please don't tell Kimmel and Short." And it's a message from Tojo, one of the Japanese commanders. And then at the bottom it says, ironically, they didn't tell them. It's putting the blame for Pearl Harbor directly on the administration. And this is a cartoon from 1945. So people knew, but this has been written out of history. As I said, if you had lost loved ones at Pearl Harbor, or your father or other relations had been scapegoated, I could understand that you would be angry about this. And in 1995, at the urging of the families of Admiral Kimmel and General Short, Congress reopened the Pearl Harbor inquiry. Again, to be straightforward with you, the inquiry was rigged. It was denied. They could not produce all sorts of evidence that I've produced for you today. It was a setup. It was a whitewash. Present there in that photograph, you can see one of the grandsons of Admiral Kimmel and two of his sons, who I would imagine would have been very angry. Decades later, they still wanted to clear their father's name. And I don't blame them for that at all. This still reverberates down through history. Speaking of which, the new Pearl Harbor. So just in case you would accuse me and this fine book, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, of being irrelevant, I'm going to suggest to you very strongly that they are not irrelevant at all. In fact, that they are screamingly relevant. The attacks on the US of September 11th, 2001 have been called by many people, including this author, David Ray Griffin, who's written a number of books about this, the new Pearl Harbor. And even the mainstream media declared the attacks of September 11, 2001 to be the new Pearl Harbor. It's interesting, isn't it, that perhaps they don't quite know how right they are. Now, they're leading up to September 11th, 2001, there was a US think tank called the Project for the New American Century. It was populated by neocons, the so-called neocons. You can see some of the people who populated the Project for the American Century there: John Kerry, Joe Biden, all sorts of dubious figures. The Project for the New American Century, in its report about maintaining US hegemony and dominance around the world, its report, Rebuilding America's Defenses, in that report, this is before September 11, that report declared that to maintain US military dominance, US hegemony on the world stage, there would have to be a process of transformation, likely to be a long one, absent some sort of catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. So these neocons who were behind this Project for a New American Century were declaring publicly that to maintain their hegemony, to maintain their power, there had to be a kind of new Pearl Harbor, a new catalyzing event that would awaken the US public, who after things, after Vietnam and various other failed and unpopular foreign entanglements, were not very keen on the idea of further wars and further entanglements. Isn't that interesting? That's an interesting parallel, isn't it? It's almost like it's played out of the same playbook. And again, you'll remember I mentioned earlier on that President Roosevelt declared the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor a day of infamy. And here we have the media, the Washington Times, after the attacks of September 11, 2001, again declaring it a day of infamy in a haunting echo of 1941. I would suggest to you that there are also larger lessons to be learnt from this. There are obvious historical lessons to be learnt there, but I would argue that also what we saw in Pearl Harbor was a kind of false flag attack. It was a provocation, a deliberate provocation, a false narrative to drag the nation to war. And I would argue that that is historically relevant to this day, that there are malignant powers in our world who will manipulate situations and will not think twice about sacrificing thousands, even of their own population, to get the strategic advantages and to get the results that they want. They will not think twice about sacrificing thousands of average folk to get what they want. But also, I would argue there are even larger lessons to be learnt from that. And they're about the kind of narratives that are fed to us and that we as a population are expected to accept. This kind of narrative that, as it was, and there was massive amounts of propaganda about the heathen Japanese and their unprovoked attack. This sort of what I would call an infantile narrative, that there are just these bad guys who just attack for no reason and you can't understand it. They're just bad and therefore they do bad stuff. And that's why things happen. And, whoever's pushing that narrative is blameless and innocent and there's nothing else to see here. I would argue that events like Pearl Harbor and 9/11 are really key to establishing this sort of psychic naivety in the population. These naive narratives that argue that, oh, for no reason, out of the blue, this terrible thing just happened. Nobody's responsible except for those very bad guys over there, the demonized people who just attacked us for no reason. It makes no sense, but we've got to give them what they deserve. These very, very infantile, childish narratives that strip events of any sort of deeper meaning or motivations. Perhaps there were reasons why people did these things. Perhaps there are deeper stories underneath these things. What we get through the media, through this infantile narrative that is established through society, the education system, academia, Hollywood, entertainment, media, the whole thing gives us these incredibly childish narratives that are really, I think, key to dumbing people down and making them accept these stories, these fables that actually don't make any kind of sense. If you employ the tiniest bit of critical thinking, they make no sense whatsoever, these narratives, you know. And as I tried to point out today, from this magnificent book, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbour, people knew at the time. They did everything they could. I mean, this is it's written by an admiral in the US Navy, and it's endorsed by 2 other admirals. But most likely, you've never heard of this book. It's not acknowledged in mainstream history whatsoever. You'll never hear about it on the History Channel, etc., etc., etc. But here it is. It exists in flesh and blood. Look, there's Theobald on the back. Here it is. It's real. Thank you for watching the Forbidden Book Club. Thank you for watching All Out of Bubblegum. It has been my pleasure to be your host today. Exactly, Ed. You can see all episodes of All Out of Bubblegum, even the ones that have been nuked and censored, on alloutofbubblegum.net. You can also access these broadcasts as podcasts on alloutofbubblegum.net. You can go to alloutofbubblegum.net and support this program. Your support is most gratefully received. We thank you. The people who've made suggestions, the people who've sent in books, they are all gratefully received. They are uniformly excellent suggestions. Thank you very much indeed. Do go to alloutofbubblegum.net. Watch other episodes. Do support All Out of Bubblegum if you can. Thank you. Thank you, Ed. Till next time.
Torn away from the light, caged in the dark, dark night, broken down, limbs of pain, shoulders Pray and I pray.